So thank you for joining. This is our part three of our webinar series on the Green Amendment. I am Joshua Cohen, Director of Campaigns at Environmental Advocates of New York. This webinar series has been hosted by Green Amendments for the Generations, Adirondack Mountain Club, and Environmental Advocates of New York. So some of you have been on some of the others in the series. We will have, I know someone just asked a question about an update from webinar 2. So we will review some of the content of the previous webinars on this particular webinar, but this one is largely focused on taking action and sort of next steps in the Green Amendment campaign. So many of you are local elected officials, and we appreciate your interest in this campaign and excited to hear from you today. A few logistics to note. There is both a chat function and a Q&A function below. Many of you are very familiar with Zoom at this point. We will have a Q&A in the middle of our agenda today, and you'll have an opportunity to either type your question into the Q&A box. Please try to use that one rather than the chat box if you can. And you can also raise your virtual hand, and we'll unmute you to ask your question during the Q&A section. Amanda Sachs, who's our campaigns associate at Environmental Advocates of New York, and I will be moderating the Q&A portion of this call. So there'll also be time in the last section of the webinar where we'll promote everyone to panelists, everyone on this call, which means we'll unmute you and encourage all of you to turn on your video, and we'll have more of a general discussion at that point. So the agenda for this call is we'll begin with a general overview and benefits of the Green Amendment. For those who may not have been on some of the past webinars, and also just a recap for those who were. This will be followed by actions that can be taken at the local level, such as passing resolutions to support the State Environmental Bill of Rights in New York. Then we'll have 15 minutes or so for the Q&A. This will be followed by the process and actions of passing a local resolution. We'll have specific examples from New Jersey. And we'll also hear from Liz Thomas, who's a former supervisor of the town of Ulysses on here. And then we'll open it up, as I said, for the broader discussion and to provide an opportunity for folks to ask questions. So I will now hand it over to Maya Van Rossum, who is the founder of Green Amendments for the Generations, a grassroots nonprofit organization inspiring the nationwide movement to secure constitutional recognition and protection of environmental rights in every state and ultimately at the federal level. You may also know Maya as the Delaware Riverkeeper, leader of the watershed-based advocacy organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, for over 25 years. I hand it over to you, Maya.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Do I have screen sharing abilities? Hopefully. Have you handed that over to me? Hi, everybody. Sorry.
So just the green button at the bottom, Maya.
Yep, I've done it, and okay, there it came up. It was just delaying on my end. Perfect. Great. So you have already been given a wonderful welcome from Joshua from Environmental Advocates of New York, but also from Green Amendments for the Generations Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I want to welcome you. And Kathy Pedler is on as a participant from the Adirondack Mountain Club. So if she could, I'm sure she would say the same thing. So, but this is a really great collaboration and a growing collaboration, and we're also pleased to have you here with us today. I just got my introduction, so I don't need to do that again. So this is a really brief primer. It's either going to be a refresher for those of you who participated in webinars 1 and 2 or have heard a previous talk about this subject, or for those who didn't have that opportunity, it'll give you a little bit of a foundation so that you can effectively participate in the conversation. But it really is going to be just a few minutes so we can get on to the group work. But what a Green Amendment is, and a Green Amendment is a term that I've coined and defined. So this is how I define it, is that it is an amendment that's placed in the Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights section of a constitution. Right now we're focused on the state constitution, that recognizes and protects the inalienable rights of all people to clean water, clean air, and a healthy environment. It is self-executing, which means that the addition of the language to the Constitution gives it enforceable legal life instantly. You don't need your legislators or regulators to pass laws or regulations to give it legal definition or life. The language itself accomplishes that. And because of the placement and the language, it ensures that environmental rights are protected in the same way we protect all of the other rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. The state of New York has a Green Amendment proposal. This is actually the language that each person shall have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment. This provision has already been passed once by the New York legislature in 2019, both houses, and it needs to be passed by both houses again next year before it can go before the people, before all of you for a vote. But this is the language, right? It's pretty simple, it's pretty basic. Other states have different language, but this is what's being advanced in the state of New York. Pretty broad brush strokes, how a Green Amendment changes things. Again, the most important thing is that environmental rights are protected in the same way we protect speech, religion, property, gun, due process rights, all the other rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. So just think about how powerfully all of those rights are protected because they begin, because they are recognized in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. That same legal strength comes to play for environmental rights. It means that government necessarily, every government official necessarily must include from day one in their legislating, regulating, funding, decision-making, permitting, they must consider or include a focus on prevention of harm, prevention of pollution in the first instance. Just think about when a legislature goes to pass a law that might infringe on speech or gun rights. What do? They think, oh my goodness, we are constitutionally restrained from infringing on speech or gun rights unless we can demonstrate a compelling state interest to do so. And because of that restraint due to the constitutional amendment, they immediately begin to think about how are we going to craft this legislation so we do not in fact infringe on speech or gun rights. Same thing happens now with the environment. They have to, if they believe there's going to be an infringement, they must focus first on how do we avoid the infringement, meaning how do we prevent environmental degradation? How do we prevent pollution and harm? Part of that decision-making process necessarily requires government officials to think about the facts, the science related to the decision they're about to engage in, and the impacts. The ramifications of the action or activity they're going to take. They have to think about the individual impacts from the individual development or industrial operation, but they also have to think about the cumulative impacts. What else is happening in a community? What else is happening in a watershed? What other assaults are being inflicted upon the natural resources that are going to be impacted by this action, activity, or decision? So again, it just results in more informed, strengthened, meaningful decision-making. Every government official at every level of government, from the town council, right, to the state legislature, to the governor, and everyone in between, becomes duty-bound to protect the constitutional environmental rights of all the people in the state, of all of their constituents. Environmental justice is tremendously strengthened because all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, income, where they live, have the same constitutional right. And so government officials become duty-bound to protect the rights of all the people equitably, right? No longer can we sacrifice one community in order to benefit another, and repeatedly sacrifice one community over and over in order to protect the rights of others. The goal is better decisions from the get-go, but if you believe that your government officials have overstepped, they didn't get it right, and they have advanced actions, activities, legislations, regulations, permitting that infringes on your constitutional right, The amendment gives you immediate access to the court. So you can try to vindicate your right based on the constitutional language itself. Green amendments are very empowering for advocates, right? Because emotionally, right now, you are no longer just a tree hugger, right? In your eyes or the eyes of others, you are now somebody that is advocating for a constitutional right. And that is just emotionally and intellectually empowering for people to help them as they go forth in their advocacy, but it also gives them a strong platform upon which they can build their advocacy, beginning every conversation with, I have a constitutional right to clean water and air and a healthful environment. I believe that that this is being infringed upon, or that right empowers you, legislators or town council, to do something positive and good I'm seeking for you to do. So it's very beneficial for advocacy, but it also does strengthen litigation. And in the 2 states where we have green amendments, Pennsylvania and Montana, we have been able to roll back very pro-fracking legislation. We have been able to force the pullback of, we being the broader we, not just me, we the broader environmental community, force the pullback of permitting for devastating gold mining operations, and much, much more. So it also strengthens litigation when it comes to environmental protection. So with that, that's my brief primer on the values and benefits of getting a constitutional green amendment added to the New York State Constitution. And with that, I turn it back to you, Joshua.
Thank you, Maya. We will now hear from Kate Carrera, who is the Deputy Director of Environmental Advocates of New York. She is an attorney admitted to practice in New York and Victoria, Australia, and has experience in environmental climate change and water law. Kate has vast experience working with international, federal, and state governmental bodies. Hand it over to you, Kate.
Awesome, thanks for that. Welcome everyone, and thank you, Maya, for that great update. I'm always love listening to you talk about the Green Amendment, and so honored to be part of this campaign taking place in New York and trying to secure Green Amendment. I won't duplicate what Maya went through, but so what I was going to talk about is just very briefly, Maya already really touched on it, but I'll just reiterate some of the points about what exactly needs to happen in New York State to secure a Green Amendment. And then really the bulk of what the rest of this webinar and presentation is going to go over is how you can help. So we're, while I don't know who everyone is that has joined the webinar, the idea is that, of course, different levels of government can really help secure this Green Amendment at the state level. And then we'll go through a sample resolution template that we put together that we'll be happy to share to others, with others. So as Maya mentioned, securing Green Amendment in New York is a process that requires a bill, a legislative action at the state level for a bill to be passed by 2 consecutive legislatures and then to go on a ballot. So there's basically 3 very significant opportunities to get involved in terms of trying to secure this amendment in terms of local government, constituents, residents, advocates, etc. Maya mentioned the first passage, or what we refer to as first passage. The first bill was passed in April 2018, which means this bill needs to be passed a second time, or we refer to it as second passage, and this will be, we will be working towards that in 2021. And then after that, if all goes well and the bill is passed in 2021, the first time it could be available on a ballot vote would be in November 2021. The reason that it's important to talk about second passage and a little bit between first and second passage. First passage, we really had the political will in the interest of the state legislature to pass the Green Amendment when they did, which was great. And I think what we're going to experience and why the information we're going to talk through the rest of the webinar is extremely important is that we will receive a lot stronger opposition in New York, or at least it's anticipated with the second passage. So that's really important in terms of mobilizing our engagement efforts, our advocates, our local levels of government in support really to support a second passage. So this kind of moves into how can you help? So as I mentioned, multiple levels of engagement and support are critically important, especially when we're going to be working up against some pretty heavy opposition from the business industry and communities that we've experienced before, but the stakes are higher with second passage. We'll go into this a little bit. What we'll go into after is just about what local governments can do in terms of passing resolutions. And I'll go, in the next slide, I'll go a little bit into that further. Another level of engagement that's very important is engaging with your state representatives, showing support in different ways, if that means communicating, signing petitions, writing letters to your state representatives, engaging your constituents and residents, as well as using communication tools such as letters to editor. And we'll have some sample materials to share with those that are interested to kind of help you move through this process, like sample letters to the editor. So just a little bit on local resolutions and why they're important and why we've kind of focused on that. So obviously, many of you might be joining from municipal councils or local government bodies and would certainly understand the difference between local ordinances and local resolutions. And I guess what I wanted to just clarify here, the reason that a local resolution is important is that a resolution at the local level would be in support of a green amendment in the state. So local municipalities are not themselves enacting a green amendment in their area. They're really resolving that they support something at a broader level. And that's an important distinction because, we're talking about a constitutional amendment. So we're not talking about necessarily a local law. We're talking about an articulation of support from the local, from local municipalities and governments for an amendment to the Constitution. And why that's really important is that the collective message is really, really powerful, and that resolutions are an expression of course, the public through the representation of local officials. So we have this idea or this kind of idealistic idea, if we could get a resolution from every single county in New York State or every single city or town, what kind of message that would send to our state about the value of a green amendment and what our residents and what our constituents want and need. So with that, we're going to put up an example of a resolution. And I think, Colleen, you have that.
And we'll be sending out some of this language after for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So what we've developed is a sample resolution template. Now I know New Jersey has done something similar. So this came from something we had worked on with Maya, but adapted it for the New York context, which it makes a lot of sense. Now, this is, of course, just a template or an example. Local governments and municipalities are welcome to do whatever they want. And I think we will hear later from Elizabeth, who did their own version in their locality, which may not look like this at all. But this is kind of collectively, when we put our heads together of what something could look like, this would be our suggestion. So in the yellow bits is kind of really where you would plug in your information. So it's a resolution, and I think acknowledging you could have a resolution at various levels of government. So whether it be county, town, village, city, it really could be adopted at any level. So as I mentioned before, resolutions are really an articulation of a local body's intent or desire or will for something. And the resolution is appropriate in this standpoint because it doesn't really have the effect of or the character of a real local ordinance or law that might include a penalty or some kind of other characteristics that that give rights and duties to it doesn't do that, right? This is really more of about a formal articulation of support of a green amendment. So that's why we can include a lot of information in here that talks about environmental issues that are happening at the local level and why this is so important to your municipality to bring forward. So it kind of starts, the way that we've drafted is, it starts pretty general about saying the right to New York, that we all acknowledge we have a right to clean air, water, and healthy environment, and that's not given protection under the state constitution. Excuse me. And it just goes on to different kind of proclamations about why it's important to have a green amendment. And then the next bit is the why part. So why is it important for our municipality or our level of government to have this, and why are we in support? And so, we think this is a good place where different local environmental concerns could be articulated. So while we don't necessarily know what every single locality is facing in terms of environmental issue, this is a good space in the resolution to articulate what's going on in your community, what's going on in your county or your regional area that's really important. So we've given a kind of an example or a list of examples of different environmental issues. Of course, these are just examples. A resolution being passed on Long Island might have significant discussion about impacts of sea level rise from climate change, whereas a resolution being drafted or passed in Western New York near the Finger Lakes may have more about water quality and algal blooms and other things that are relevant to that region. So in this area, we've kind of listed a number of example environmental issues that affect different areas. And then it goes on to basically say, in recognition of the first bill that was passed, we support this language. We support an amendment to the Constitution that provides for the Green Amendment, and basically resolving that the municipality, obviously as a representation of its constituents or the people, support a second passage of a Green Amendment by the state legislature. So that's the sample resolution. And I guess the other follow-on point, and I think we're going to open up for discussion after, is that the multi-levels, because after second passage, a ballot vote will happen. This is a really important way to articulate to the constituencies or to the people that are going to be putting their individual votes on a ballot. So one way of educating voters and constituents of the Green Amendment and that support. So with that, that's pretty much what I was going to talk through, Maya. Happy to move on.
Thank you, Kate. We now have time for Q&A. And again, we will have more topics we'll cover after this 15-minute break, where we'll have an opportunity now for people to ask questions. I again encourage you to try to use the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat option. And you can type a message into it, or you can raise your virtual hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question if you'd like. So it looks like we have one question lined up already from Lisa. Amanda, would you care to read that one?
Sure. Lisa asks, could you provide an example, say if this were in place and we wanted to ban pesticides in Lake George, what our steps would be? Would we start right off in court? Would it be incumbent on residents to bring a suit? Would we just need a lawyer to argue for us in court the facts as we have compiled them? Does it take a long time to get a court date? Are there lawyers that are specifically Green Amendment advocates? There's a lot of questions in here. I'm not sure who wants to go first, or if you want to break it up.
I'm fine if you want to take the first crack, Kate, and then
Okay.
or vice versa. It all's good.
I think these are all good questions. I think maybe the one point I might start with is to clarify what the Green Amendment resolution process is and is not, or what And I'm not sure, I guess, or maybe she's talking from the perspective if a Green Amendment were already part of the Constitution. I'm going to just start with the first point, and it may or may not be where she's gone, but so the resolution itself does not really have the force of law. It is just something that's in support of a constitutional amendment. If your question, I think maybe what your question is that if we had a Green Amendment as part of our Constitution, how would we go about using it to ban pesticides? Maya, is that how you interpret it?
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So right, I think, I'll start, Maya, but you're super good at obviously taking these kind of questions. And I think part of it is understanding when the government made a decision to use the pesticides in a certain way or when it was permitted. It's that assessment of like, did they take into account whether or not that was fundamentally impacting the residents' right to clean water or clean air, if there's perhaps drift from pesticides depending on how it was used. If the decision were to made to actually use the Green Amendment to litigate, you would need to get a lawyer to kind of work through those arguments. And I might switch it to you in terms of like getting court dates and kind of that procedural stuff, because you've experienced it in many other areas.
Sure. So, but I think that was a great start, and happy to build on that. So, there are, as Kate said, a couple of layers. So here in the first instance, right, it sounds like the beginning of your question is, how would you use a Green Amendment to ban pesticides? So there you're not jumping to litigation, right? You could use the Green Amendment to go to your town, to go to the legislators, to go to whomever it is you're trying to target from a decision-making perspective and say, I want you to pass a resolution, an ordinance, legislation, regulations, whatever, to ban pesticides. And I am advocating for this because, the science and the impacts demonstrate it's a good thing, but also because you have this constitutional obligation to protect my right to clean water and a healthful environment, right? And so there you're using it proactively to advocate for something good. From a litigation perspective, you have to have something to litigate over. So first off, Kate made that really important observation. Part of, let's say that there was a permit that was issued to use pesticides in a dangerous place near a local waterway that was going to have significant water quality ramifications, right? Well, you might start with first assessing whether or not there was that informed decision-making. One of the things that we've been able to do in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is we've been able to force the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to pull back a permit or decision-making because they were unable to demonstrate that they considered the science and the impacts. And so there you can bring a procedural challenge, and you might be able to get the agency, the town council, whoever it is you're targeting, to have to step back on their decision. They may stay stepped back, or they may engage in that informed decision making, and you may find yourselves ending up with the same decision, but at least it was more informed and you would have had a genuine opportunity to change the outcome. Let's say now you do have informed decision making, you have this permit or this ordinance that allows the use of pesticides in dangerous places in dangerous ways. Well, there you would be bringing litigation to challenge that action or activity that allowed that dangerous activity, right? And that's what you're challenging. You may have a situation, and we actually have another situation like this in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's not in pesticides, but it's a very highly contaminated site where we are saying that the government action was the failure to act to clean up a highly toxic site for over 3 decades. So in the pesticide context, you may be able to craft an argument where a failure of government to act that is resulting in people just wantonly using pesticides everywhere, that's creating a very serious and significant hazard to the environment. Maybe the failure to act is what you're going to ground your legal action on. But for all of this, not for the advocacy, that's just you using your power, your passion, your smarts, your words, your science. But when you do get to the litigation front, you are going to need to have an attorney. You are going to want to craft the legal argument and the strategy with the attorney, whichever of the multiple paths that I just identified. Ideally, you talk with the attorney as soon as possible so that they could inform your advocacy if you think you're going to be on a litigation path. And in terms of how long it takes, you know, your guess is as good as mine, right? Mm-hmm. Courts take their time. You could file for an expedited decision if they've passed legislation or a regulation that threatens imminent harm. If implemented, you may be able to secure an injunction to prevent its implementation while you advance your challenge. But you'd have to fulfill the steps to get an injunction. But we did that in the very pro-fracking legislation in Pennsylvania. We stopped the implementation of the law while we were challenging it. And then you will have to go through the legal process, and you may have to go up several layers, right? If you appeal or somebody else appeals. So, but truly on time and timing, you know, judges can take their own sweet time. They can come out fast, and they can take, you know, a year plus to render a final decision. And so that is unfortunate. But of course, if you've gotten a stay or an injunction in place to prevent the implementation, then that status quo actually helps you. So I think we've covered, between Kate and I, answered all your questions in that very important set of questions.
Thank you both. And thank you to Lisa for that question. I want to give a shout out to Lisa as well. Lisa Adamson from Lake George recently had an LTE, letter to the editor, published on the Green Amendment. So thank you for your work on that.
Yeah.
We will actually be sending out a template letter to the editor as a resource after this webinar as well. So that's exactly the type of advocacy that we hope for. So this next question is for Kate. This is from Martin Kellerman. Mm-hmm. You would reference businesses as who would attack the Green Amendment movement. Who and what industries specifically will we be up against? I assume they'll be deep-pocketed with support from the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to take this in mind. I'm sure you would have some to add as well, because this opposition would probably be universal across in a lot of places. So most of the opposition we've heard through in New York State is to the New York State Business Council, and obviously their opposition relates a lot to, we're highly regulated under all of the environmental laws at the federal and state level, that something like this is not necessary, would open floodgates of litigation against us. You know, quite a lot of different arguments really that stem from a misunderstanding of what the amendment is and how it operates. I think you would agree with that, in that they view it as it could be used as a private right of action against a business. So like I could, as an individual, use it as a basis to challenge a business's you know, actions or decision making, and that's not the way that it's used, as we mentioned before and Maya said, although inadvertently that could be true through government permitting or government decision making that has affected a business, but it's not a direct use against a business per se. So we have, you know, really gotten a lot of opposition for them. So we would imagine that their opposition will be kind of amplified and I'm trying to think of the right word, more intense for second passage, I guess, because the stakes are higher, knowing that if it does actually receive the second passage, it will go on to a ballot. So while we did see that opposition in the first passage, I think they understand that the stakes are higher in terms of affecting the outcome on second passage. Maya, did you have anything to add?
No, not to that question. I was actually thinking, I think you handled it beautifully. I was looking at Susan's question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I can move on. So Susan says, with regard to state legislators and the vote on the second passage, what arguments do you anticipate will be made by the opponents of the Green Amendment? I think I may have covered a little bit of that. I think and Maya, jump in a lot of the arguments have to do about, you know, being unnecessary, opening floodgates of litigation. Also, courts are not equipped to understand and deal with the broad language of the amendment, because terms like healthy environment, clean air, and water are not defined. So we hear that a lot. Maya, what were you thinking?
Yeah, so same points and just our responses to them. So on the litigation front, and this, we hear this in New York, but we've also heard this in other states, right? So it's sort of, we see a lot of parallels between states. The claim of litigation, right? So they will say it opens up the floodgates of litigation, as Kate said. And really, there are two answers to that. There are two good responses to that. Three good responses to that. One, that hasn't happened in Pennsylvania and Montana. So look at reality check. Two, frivolous litigation would be the litigation that you would be concerned about. And the truth is, there are other limitations on frivolous litigation. Lawyers can be subject to sanctions. They can lose their license. There are all sorts of serious ramifications for lawyers who pursue frivolous litigation. So that's really sort of a red herring argument. Not to the least of which is, if a lawyer brings frivolous litigation, they will lose, and their client will still have to pay, and their clients will be pissed off and they won't have a client anymore. And if there is well-grounded litigation, whether it is successful in the end or not, but if it's allowed to go forward through the courts despite efforts by government or industry to get the case dismissed, well, then that's good litigation. That means something bad is happening in the environment. And whatever the outcome of that litigation, we should be happy that it moves forward, because it's either solving a problem or pointing out a problem that needs to be addressed in another way. So litigation's a red herring. Economics, and adverse impacts on the economy or the jobs, another red herring. In my book, The Green Amendment, there's a whole chapter on this, and there's study after study after study demonstrating a healthy environment supports a healthy economy. And actually, a degraded environment is harmful to jobs, the economy, and increased costs for healthcare, for responding to flooding and flood damages, and more. So that's another false argument. Kate mentioned the broad language. What is clean water? What is clean air? Well, the truth is, what is the right to be free from an unreasonable search and seizure? What's unreasonable? What's the right blanket to free speech, right? There are actually limitations on speech. So the courts are well equipped when faced with litigation to help define those terms. The legislators or regulators define it in the first instance through their legislation, their regulation, their decision making. They should engage in informed decision making. And then when you challenge it in the courts, right, then everybody makes their case, and yes, the judges become the final arbiters based on what's presented to them, and they're well equipped to do that. And then the only other sort of really odd one that we heard in the state of Maryland recently from what was a pro-environmental legislator but was anti-Green Amendment was that all the other rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution are absolute, and you can't have absolute protection of the environment. You can't have no pollution of the water or no pollution of the air. And as with all these other arguments, that's really a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of the law. There are limitations on your right to free speech and freedom of religion and gun rights and private property rights. They all have reasonable, informed limitations designed to serve the greater good. And the same would come to play when it comes to the environment. So those are the kinds of things that we hear. And as I think that you've heard from both of our answers, there's a good response to every single one of them.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, Susan. Susan Dubois is a great friend of Environmental Advocates of New York. So we're excited that you're on this webinar. I know you've been on the others as well. And you've been a strong climate advocate in the Albany area for a long time. And I was actually told that you worked on our bomb train campaign many years ago, back in 2014, which was actually some of the sort of preliminary work that inspired us to work on the Green Amendment. So thank you for that. So we have one follow-up question from Lisa, but we're a little bit past time, so I might hold that question until the end. We'll have more time for questions then, if that's all right. And I will hand it back to you, Kate, to continue your presentation.
Great. So I thought maybe this was more of the point where we're going to kind of take questions about walk through the resolution. Is that right?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay.
And maybe also how you would sort of approach a township or a municipality to ask that they pass a resolution. And that was actually, that does relate to Lisa's question, which was if you say to a municipal board that they have the constitutional obligation that they say they don't want to handle this, what do you do then? So they're sort of related, but yeah, this is more of the sort of how to sort of
how to kind of go
through the
about it. Yeah. So I mean, I think like a lot of the way that local laws and pass, I mean, of course, it's finding the sponsor who's really dedicated and wants to bring this to their local municipal board. If it's a county I mean, again, this will vary very widely depending on what level of government we're talking about. If we're talking about a county legislature versus a village select board, or however they're organized. So in terms of how much buy-in you need to get and who needs to agree is going to be probably very widely different. You know, working at a county level, the way that we would kind of suggest and approach it is finding a county legislator who is, you know, interested and passionate about this and going through the process of putting together a template and articulating that support. And then, of course, working that in terms of getting co-sponsors, this will be very different depending on the political makeup of your local government as well. You know, I think there are certain counties in New York State that this would be particularly challenging to achieve. Depending on the type level of support. So really the first step is trying to find a champion in your local area. So if in your local elected body, so if it's like I said, a county legislature or a city council member or a village select member. I'm not quite, you know, I think there are all these different names for the different electeds. I'm not sure that I'm getting them all correctly, but you understand what I'm saying. Finding a champion or two that can kind of progress this. And I think the idea is that we'd like to make this as easy as possible. And that's why we're putting together these materials. So you have a template, you have a basis of language to start from. So you're not just out there cold. And, you know, Maya and I and environmental advocates and Adirondack Mountain Club, we're all here as resources to help local governments kind of go through this work if this is what they choose they want to do. And we really hope that a lot of you on the call that or if you are an elected official would consider this as something, or if you know people communicating this to members in your local area, something that residents would support and want to see from a local body. And then, yeah, working through whatever, you know, whatever process at your local level is required for passing a resolution. And then the next step really is if you did secure a passage of a resolution, as we'll hear later in Tompkins County, and I believe the other one is Interlaken.
Seneca County.
Seneca County. You know, we'll hopefully hear from members of those who've done resolutions in those areas to kind of give a more on the ground of how they did it. And then it would be communicating that information obviously upward to your state representatives. So, you know, the state representatives understand that there's a message coming from their localities, their constituents of support. And then, as I mentioned in my presentation, communicating it or using it to educate your residents. Now, presumably your resolution is a resolution of your constituency, of the people supporting this, but also I just see it as a two-way, using it as a two-way, in two ways, I suppose.
Great.
Maya, do you have anything to add? I mean, in terms of your experience in resolutions that have been made in New Jersey here, I feel like we're just still, there's only 2 that I know of in New York, so.
Yeah. So everything you said applies directly. And I think the only thing that I would add is, number one, right now, there's a lot of bad stuff happening. And so this is a great opportunity to advance something positive and good and proactive. And you might find your town and your local governing body more open to that, right? Because they want to champion something good. And especially you can make a COVID connection, of course, with environmental degradation. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is just to make clear that what we've done in New Jersey, what I think, as Kate alluded to, what we would do in New York is there are a lot of ways to do this. You could invite one of our organizations, ask us, individually or as a group, and we'll send somebody to do the presentation for you or with you. We could give you talking points and information so that you could do the presentation, but one of us will commit to be there to help deal with the questions that will come, because while you might feel confident making the pitch for the resolution, you might be worried about responding to the questions that you might get. So we could have somebody be there with you to just make sure you have confidence that somebody will be there to answer the questions. Or we can just give you the information. You can go forth and do it on your own because you do feel confident about that, and then sort of report back. And if there's some resistance or hesitation or some outstanding questions, then we can help you after the fact with the follow-up. And the final thing is, while certainly success in getting a resolution is the goal, and it is powerful in all the ways that Kate said, there is also, it's okay to fail, because as Kate said, it's an incredible education opportunity, messaging opportunity for your friends, for your neighbors, and for your town council. And there will be another election, or they may evolve over time. Things change. When you advocate on any issue before a governing body, it's sometimes you get it the first shot, but sometimes you need to do it 2, 3, 4, or 5 times, and then you get there. But every single one of those times is an opportunity to spread the word. And so we've had a number of successes in New Jersey. They're similar, but all a little bit different. But we've also had some where people were unsuccessful in getting the resolution, but they were successful in educating others in their community, and they ended up getting invited onto a radio show or interviewed for the press, and that actually created a platform for them to spread the message even more broadly beyond their community, right? So those were other powerful positives that came out of the effort that they felt really good about. So there's lots of opportunity, lots of value, lots of benefits, and lots of ways to do it, and our collective groups are here to help you do it in the way that feels most comfortable to you.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ma. Just to, I wanted to add on, so not only do we obviously have the template resolution, but there are a series of materials that kind of will help you either way. So not only just a general fact sheet, but the FAQ that was circulated after the second webinar. Of course, all this material being made available really goes into some of those rebutting some of the arguments that we talked about before, so you can to help you respond to those difficult questions that you would get.
Thank you. I know, Maya, you were just talking about New Jersey. Do you want to share any more on the New Jersey experience you've had, or?
No,
anything?
I think
Okay.
that covered it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. I will hand it over to Liz Thomas if she is on. I know she was juggling a few things on her end, but Liz is the former supervisor of the town of Ulysses in Tompkins County, and we have worked with her on some of our water advocacy campaigns. So she has passed a green amendment in Ulysses, so I wanted to hand it over to her and her grandchild to share her experience.
I was a little worried about this. I'm going to be bouncing around just for a little while. My husband's getting a bottle, but everything was peaceful up until like 30 seconds ago. So hello, this is the new normal with this one's parents working now. So here we are, but it's cool. We can get all kinds of work done. So, but it's been great listening to everybody. This has been, this is just warms my heart that this is still moving along, and certainly I'm working on another assembly person that is running for office and at the state level. So that makes a big difference too. So the environmental work was my whole reason for running for office back in 2008, and I am in the town of Ulysses in Tompkins County, which is got a reputation for being progressive. So it is a little easier to get things going here. So we take advantage of that. Also, the town of Ulysses is on Cuga Lake. It borders the lake, and there's tons of water and gorges. And you know, that water is really precious to many, and it's not political. I mean, you know, everybody uses the lake here, and so protecting it is it's nice to have it not be so political. Also, I hate to say it, but the HABs outbreak has helped us here because everybody is realizing that we've been ignoring the lake quality for a long time. So all right, Ulysses is 5,000 people, and so it's small. And I think often people think, you know, what can a little municipality do? But we can do a lot. It's kind of cool because it's with small municipalities, it's sort of like grassroots. In a town, we don't have fire departments. Normally we don't have fire departments. We don't have police departments. We don't have very many sidewalks or, you know, water treatment and all that. So it gives us a little more time to focus on some of these things. So hang on one second. Oh, and maybe I can sit down now and stop bouncing around for you. And I agree with Maya that you know, there's certain pieces of legislation that I've tried to pass, or that people say, oh, you know, don't try that. It didn't work the last time, and you know, we've tried it a couple of times. And what I say is, hey, there's different people, there's different times, there's different reasons. So it's always worth trying again. So I'll just give you some of the examples of some of the legislation that Ulysses has passed in the environmental realm of things. So we were one of the first municipalities to, one of the first towns to ban fracking. And what we did was we worked with Dryden and the town of Ithaca. We banded together some advocates, just a few elected officials and our attorneys, and all worked on that language to put into zoning, to zone it out. So, you know, we all passed our new zoning within probably 3 months of each other. And of course, everybody knows that Dryden was hit with the lawsuit, but Ithaca and Ulysses were committed to supporting whoever it was that was getting hit. So we all worked together to be together Friends of the Court. So we had about 50 municipalities that were Friends of the Court on that. So yes, it is easier. We do have usually progressive boards, but it's still hard. One thing though, it does seem easier when one municipality passes some legislation. It's just easier for others to do the same. It's setting a precedent. It's giving other elected officials something to lean on. So, and there's also, I mean, you know, you can say so-and-so did it, so why don't we do it? It's also a little bit competitive, you know, for the boards that are progressive. You know, you can say, you can use a little shaming. It's like, come on, guys, you know, we did it. You do it too, or reassurance. It depends on the people you're working with. So anyway, some other examples, and I think Maya, you probably had a lot to do with this one. We passed a resolution to become Friends of the Court for a riverkeeper suit against the New York State DEC concerning CAFO permitting process. And that lawsuit was successful against the DEC. I don't know whatever happened. I don't think the permitting process changed, but that was a pretty big one. And we started that when there were only like, gosh, I don't think there were more than 4 municipalities that were friends of the court on that one. So what I usually do is find the coalition of the willing. So other boards who are likely to move on similar legislation, and then work as a team and build on each other's momentum. In Tompkins County, one thing that's a little bit difficult is that we have a county legislature, not a board of supervisors. So spreading the word, we just don't have a very good venue for the city, the villages, and the town to talk together. So Tompkins County does have this thing called the Tompkins County Council of Governments, and it does meet monthly, but it doesn't have any staff other than someone to take the minutes. So if we did have a staff person, it would be a lot easier to move some of the legislation along, but you know, we do it anyways. It does seem like environmentalists are quite dedicated to moving things forward, so we're lucky that way. There is on the Tompkins County Council of Governments, there is an energy subcommittee and environment subcommittee. So, and that's where we have that coalition of the willing, is what I call it, to form. So how to do it? I mean, when you identify the threat first, and how it will, I always try and describe how it will affect individuals, because people are often kind of selfish. If it doesn't affect them, you know, it doesn't rise to the top of the pile. So my board, even though they all are Democrats, but they do their due diligence. They're very skeptical, and it takes a lot of time to convince them to do things. And that's good. They're doing their duty. They want all the information to be laid out carefully. So with any group that I'm working with, any municipality, I usually call it the rule of 3, where the first time I'll mention something, and it's met with kind of glazed eyes. They just don't understand. And so then at the next meeting, I'll present it again, same way, a little more detail, and you can see like there's a little bit of awareness that kind of comes along with it. The third time, it seems like there's quite a lot of understanding. And then honestly, it seems like finally somebody else says, hey, here's a really good idea, let's move ahead. And then, so, you know, whoever moves it ahead, that's fine with me as long as it moves ahead. So it does, the point is, it takes a while for people to understand. And it doesn't even seem to matter like who's presenting the information. It's just, you know, when elected officials, especially at any level, have so much on their plate. So and you know, they may not have the expertise in these areas, so you have to educate them to get them up to the level where, you know, they're going to say, all right, fine, you know, we do feel like this is important. So what I always mention along with it is our core mission, which is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of our residents. So that is repeated a lot of times when I'm trying to move something like this along. I explain what can be done and give the critical details. I give them background. I do the homework to explain how the legislation can move ahead, and I provide draft legislation. And then if it's something really difficult, I try to pack the room with advocates. It's surprising, it is really surprising how many people will cave when there's a room full of people saying, you need to do this. And you know, it can be the wrong thing, the wrong decision, but it's really hard for people to stand up against a room full of people who are saying, please do this. So I also, either I or I try to convince other people to call town board members and to not only express their support for the legislation to move ahead, but to hear the concerns of the legislators themselves and to say, all right, what are your worries about passing this? And then when if the legislation is controversial, I always think it's important when you're putting that legislation into law or passing resolution that there's a statement for why. So just make sure that there's the rationale there so that they have that to lean on. And so presuming that you're successful, then you have a piece of legislation. You can get a certified resolution. That here is the law. And once you have that all in hand, it's time to spread the word. So, again, if one municipality has passed new legislation, send it to everybody else in the county, and see if there are any other elected officials that are willing to be the advocate to push that forward. I use notarized copies so that, and just scan them, but they can see that it's been notarized, that here is the actual new local law, here is the resolution that it passed. And then in the resolution too, I always make sure that it says who to send it to, because we've had troubles in the past with our clerks, just like having a resolution and not knowing what to do with it. So the last part of the resolution always is, and instructs a person resolve that the town clerk mail notarized copies of this resolution to XYZ person. And it's usually it's for something like this, it's usually the two New York State sponsors. So the sponsor in the Senate and the sponsor in the Assembly. I always put the governor on there because why not? And any committee chairs of the committees that might be carrying the legislation forward, and then your own state legislators. We have surprisingly, Tompkins County is split up into 3 Senate districts, so all of our senators are Republican, even though Tompkins County is very much a Democratic county. So we send it to our New York State senator too. He needs to know as well. So let's see, just a few more examples of actions that the little town of Ulysses has passed that have to do with environment. And I'll have to say that if the legislation doesn't involve any money, it makes it a lot easier. If there's going to be a cost to it, then that's just one more, makes it a little bit harder. But we did adopt a natural resource inventory, and we can use that in zoning to protect, the natural resources. For example, we now actually specifically passed or adopted a wetlands map that is local and more specific than the state and federal maps, and we're using that in zoning too to protect streams and wetlands. We have buffers in the zoning. We have in the zoning along the steep slopes along Hugo Lake, we prevent tree removal unless there's certain criteria for tree removal on the steep slopes. We now have in our zoning allowance for major and minor solar installations, and we now have some large scale solar in Ulysses, which I think is great. Thanks to the Clean Energy Community Coordinator, we became a clean energy community, which allowed us to get a grant for $100,000 to install heat pumps in the town hall. So we'll be almost entirely natural gas free this summer, which is great. We have an electric vehicle charging station, solar panels on top of the town hall and town barn. And then we're friends of the court on this expansion of the salt mine under Hugo Lake. We did lose that one, or that one was lost in court, but not over. And then one time we did try to put into zoning the number of livestock per acre that was recommended by the Department of Ag in its best management practices. So we went with their own numbers, but actually the Department of Ag struck it down, saying those are only suggested best management practices and that they couldn't be put into zoning. So that was disappointing. This particular piece of legislation, the right to clean air and water in the Constitution, for us, it was pretty easy. And I think that one of the reasons why is the language is so simple. I mean, who doesn't support clean air and water? So it's very, I mean, it's just a nice little sentence. It's simple to understand. I mean, the board, when they realized that it was changing the Constitution, you know, took a little swallow. But again, it's just easy to understand and support. So I did a little bit of extra homework on that one and found legislation from other states. I know that it's Pennsylvania and Montana that actually have it in their Bill of Rights, but there are a bunch of other state constitutions that do have, that have language in their constitution protecting water. So I just excerpted that and had probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages of excerpts of other states' language in their constitution. And then so yeah, it was that little village of Interlaken who my friend Donny Del Plato, who is just wonderful. He heard about this, I don't know, probably from one of you, and passed it in Interlaken, and then he told me about it. And then I told the city of Ithaca about it, and they passed it, and then it just went on from there. So I think quite a few municipalities in Tompkins County did send in their support for that. So again, just provide the resolution for municipalities, provide the constitutional language, and provide examples of other municipalities who have adopted that language, and then hope, pray, and do your best at arguing it through. And if it doesn't work, try it again. So
Thank you, Liz.
That's all I've got.
Thank you. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate your advocacy on this. You holding your grandchild is also a good reminder of why we do this work. So thank you for fitting this in while you're doing childcare duties as well. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm no longer the town supervisor, but this water work is I've dedicated several days a week to that still. So still very much involved, and in some ways it makes it easier because then you can just be one of the advocates that goes from municipality to municipality saying, hey, you know, would you do this? So I can be one of the people packing the room now.
Thank you. I wanted to introduce Tony Del Plato, who's a trustee of and water commissioner for the town of Interlaken in Seneca County. And Tony was successful in passing a local resolution in Interlaken, and so we've asked him to share his experience in that process. So welcome, Tony. Nice to see you. Oh, and you are on mute at the moment, so we just have to make sure that we can hear you. There we go.
Hi, thank you, Josh and Maya, Kate, and Amanda, and I'm glad to be here. And how much time am I talking now? Do I have, what, 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, you have a few minutes to share your experience, and then we'll open it up to continue the conversation.
I think getting the resolution passed in the village board, the first thing I would suggest is vote out Republicans. Now, I mean that half jokingly and half seriously, because working with Republicans in Seneca County is a hotbed of conservative Republican thinking, and most are in denial, though those who accept the environmental issues that we're raising, and the Green Amendment in particular, it's because it's so straightforward, and like has been said, it doesn't matter what your personal worldview is, what your religion, wherever you are, we drink the water, we breathe the air, and all of that. I want to get back to a question that I asked about linking up to other issues. I'm working pretty closely with the New York Health Act and the physicians for a national health plan, and the Green Amendment, as far as I'm concerned, should be a fundamental thing that I've been working on the wording to link up with the New York Health Act community, because how do we reduce asthma, respiratory problems, the Green Amendment can be a great tool to say, hey, look, sure, we want healthcare for everybody, but we want to keep people healthy first. And so I think the Green Amendment really effectively can support that. And I think linking up with that group in the coming year is a way to expand the literally activist base of the group. Now, I'm a member of the Cayuga Lake Watershed Intermunicipal Organization. I'm on the executive board only because I'm the only person from Seneca County there. It doesn't mean I have any special skills or talent. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a quasi-retired chef. So, but it's through working with the intermunicipal organization that I've linked up with many municipalities and leaders on the issue of the Green Amendment, and I'm happy to say that this little village beat Ithaca and Tompkins County in getting with the first resolution. This is a little village. Now I know some of my colleagues in Ithaca, kind of like, they got a good chuckle out of that. But I think the overall importance is making clear that this Green Amendment is so straightforward and such a powerful instrument. In Ithaca has a group called CLEAN, Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Network, and there's the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network. And Ithaca and Tompkins County, there's tons of groups. Sometimes I wonder if there's more groups than people, but there's a lot of activism that goes on there. And so linking up other activist groups is a great way, I think, for us to spread the word and to build the energy that I think when we go to the voters, it's, I think having all of those groups joining on and contacting their networks is a great way to build this for the Green Amendment. And I don't have a lot more to say, but I think that looking at this issue in a holistic way. I mean, healthcare is related. I've been a cook advocating for organic agriculture for many, many decades. I've actually written chapters and cooking books and cookbooks for organic agriculture, and right now I'm working with our school district and developing a composting program. At any rate, there's I think the more we can broaden and make this issue a comprehensive and foundational issue for so much of the actions that we need to happen, I think the more successful we're going to be. It's great that Montana and Pennsylvania are there. New York may be getting close. This has got to be a nationwide issue, and I think New York can really show the way in the moment. Maybe in 2 years, Mississippi will be there too. That's about it for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. We appreciate the work you've done on this campaign and joining us today. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us and for your advocacy on this issue and for doing the work that you do. It's been great to have you. Thank you.